All right, hey, I'm live, guys. How's it going? All right, welcome. Thank you for coming to my session. My name is Vanessa Grant, and you are at Project Success Through Useful User Stories. So, who is this cheeky American in front of you? And why should you listen to me? So I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem for 13 years. I also helped write the Salesforce BA exam. Now, I was not the only SME on it. I did it with a team, but I am the most vocal about it. I am 9-time Salesforce certified, also a certified Scrum Master, and I have written thousands of user stories at this point. I have worked as a product owner, a consultant, business analyst, lead BA, and also that one stint I had as a solution architect that I don't like to discuss because it's very traumatizing. You may also not like user stories and just be here because I am very prolific on LinkedIn and Twitter. So my more professional version or my less professional, more cheeky version, you have a lovely city, by the way, very titillating. One for the fans. Thanks, guys. So, our agenda for today. One, what is a user story? Just in case you came here because you like me on Twitter, I figure get through some of the basics. How should user stories be written? There is a formula, and so we're going to talk through some of the more foundational, kind of like, you know, what makes a user story in the more formal sense. Why are user stories important? Otherwise known as if you have bad user stories, what kind of disaster can ensue? And, but really, how should they be written so that my project is successful? So some of my own tips and tricks, things that I've learned along the way that may be breaking a few of the more formal rules, but hopefully will leave you guys understanding that user stories are not just formal, that there is also a bit of an art to them. So what is a user story? First off, user stories explain the roles of users in a Salesforce system, their desired activities, and what they intend to accomplish. This is straight off of the Trailhead. Feel free to go through the Trailhead. There's a QR code if you really wanted to go to Trailhead through the QR code, whatever floats your boat. So user stories can be written, I mean, it could be solo admins writing their own user stories. It could be business analysts. It could be solution architects. It could be product owners. But it's basically a to-do list that's going to get you through your project. Done well, they are the backbone of an agile project where they can be that source of truth that will take everything from the idea all the way to production. Done poorly, let me just say that I almost titled this session, How Do You Tank a Multi-Million-Dollar Project Through Shit User Stories? And it's not just one. I've actually seen many projects where I kind of feel like a firefighter sometimes because I kind of get injected in the middle of these projects sometimes, and I go, "What's wrong, guys?" And it's like the client doesn't feel like they were understood, so they don't feel like we're already building stuff, but we didn't actually capture everything properly, or you have developers that are like, "We don't know what we're building, but we're just rolling with it." So it's imperative, really, to build that great foundation of an agile project to have quality user stories. So the formula, how should user stories be written? So I'm sure so many of you know as a who, I want to, what, so that I can, or so I can. Now, this is the formula. I would say some tips on this thing. When you're going through your who, that's going to be your persona. I have seen far too many user stories that started with as a system just because they're like, whatever, whoever's going to use this, the system's going to be doing it. But you want to think about who actually, a good way I actually like to think about it is who's going to be testing the thing. So once you get to UAT, who do you want to actually be that end user that's going to test this? And that is likely going to be your persona. So if you're kind of stuck on, I don't know who my personas are, think of it that way. You also don't want to get too generic. This whole system thing. You also don't want to get too specific. So you don't want to be like, Frank wants to do this thing, which I've also seen. When we get to the what, we are wanting to capture, what they want to accomplish. But what happens a lot of times, and another thing that I've seen a lot is you'll have companies that will say, I want a button. And it always starts, it is always a button. It's like, and then if you just kind of put that in there, you end up with like these Frankenstein kind of orgs with like 20 buttons. And ultimately, like, businesses are not trying to accomplish Salesforce buttons. So this is where, as BAs, as admins, we need to actually have those conversations, be like, what do you want the button to do? Why do you want that button? Tell me more about this magical button, and let's just maybe not call it a button. And then the why is going to be your business value. Ultimately, you want to understand what value this user story is going to bring to your business. So how should user stories be written? Now, we had a lovely session earlier from Pavel, so I'm not going to get into this too much, so I'm going to breeze through this one. So Invest, you guys can look it up. There's like a bajillion articles on this. This is like the very formal best practices of user stories. So you want them to be independent. Like if you're writing 2 user stories and like one just can't move without the other one, like maybe they should just be one user story at that point. You want to avoid dependencies. You want them to be negotiable. User stories are conversations. They are meant to evolve over the course of a project. That is agile all the way. You want to provide context, not solutions. That is what negotiable means. Valuable, I mean, kind of obvious, like if it doesn't bring any value, maybe it's not worth writing, guys. Like, maybe we shouldn't build this thing that like adds no value. I hate pronouncing it, estimable. Estimable? Anyway, estimable. So the dev team and solution architects, the admins should be able to break it down into tasks and estimate the story points based on the user story. So is it something that they're able to size? I'm gonna go down to testable because small is actually my favorite and I want to talk about that one a little bit more. But testable, so is it a user story that you can understand well enough so that you can start writing the acceptance criteria? That's where testable comes in. Now small is the most important one, I think. I was having a conversation with a certain gentleman that's in the front row, and as you do with like Salesforce community people, you start talking about user stories, and I was saying how important it was to have small user stories. He's like, oh yeah, I wrote one once and it took 3 sprints. And so really you want to get it down to like the smallest increment you can get that can be done in a sprint. The reason why small is important, I mean, obviously it improves accuracy. Like, I'm sure he didn't know, whoever that gentleman is in the front row, that it was going to take 3 sprints. It improves the time to business value. Ultimately, you want to move your stories along as quickly as you can to add the most business value as quickly as possible. And also, everybody likes to see progress. Just from like a psychological point of view, like when you give a dev like a story that takes 3 sprints, let's say, just picking a number, then it's a little bit like, is this ever going to end? Where like, if they have those smaller stories, sorry, don't take the picture while I'm doing this, please. So I can power pose or something if you need a minute. So when we're talking about the kind of the psychological benefits, like when they can move stories into done quicker, it just feels better. Like, oh wow, look at all this progress I'm making. So when you start writing your user stories and you start putting in words like and, that's when you're like, okay, I threw in a conjunction. Time to maybe think about splitting this up into 2 stories. Also, the other big thing that, and I do get down even like into like each field sometimes, like because even in Salesforce, like there's so many things that go into creating a custom field. It's important to capture that stuff. And also like with the aspect of it being small, like you don't want one little part of it to hold up that DevOps process. Like that's really the thing. You don't know what's going to go wrong, so the bigger your story, the more something is likely to go wrong that will hold up all the business value there. So why are user stories important? So I will tell you a little story of, I went to TDX back in 2022. I am not a particularly technical person, so I was expecting to fully walk in feeling like an idiot. But what I ended up discovering was, as I spoke to the different developers and architects, was they were desperate to work with people like me just because they wanted somebody who would be able to enable them to do what they do best. And not have the ambiguity and confusion that they had encountered in all these various projects when they've had, kind of garbage user stories. So unfortunately, what I do see a lot of times is, I've got here some vague version of the application lifecycle. It depends on what website you look at. It'll have different steps. But what I tend to see sometimes is like that they'll kind of put BAs in the planning stage, and that's when the user story will be written, and then nobody will touch it afterwards. And I don't know, like the BAs like go into like a cave or something, and like they just don't like guide that user story throughout the project. So user stories really, again, are the backbone for the whole cycle. So what happens if they don't get the plan right? If those user stories are written poorly? Then we start moving through the cycle. So we've got build, you've got the devs or the admin or whoever that's like, okay, I'm not clear on what we're building here. And that's a problem, a huge problem. But sometimes they still build it because some people don't feel empowered to say something or say, hey, these user stories are, does anybody else realize that these are garbage? It happens all the time. Then we get to QA, which is, I'm not really clear on what we're testing here. This is when really awesome, and I mean awesome and terrible, demos happen. Because a lot of times, if you don't have good user stories, you don't have that business context that really make great demos. So QA can get a little bit lost on like, okay, well, and then we move into UAT. It's like, no, really, what are we testing here? And then when we move into release, at that point, it's kind of like, YOLO, and let's just hope that that's what the client wanted. I don't know, like, and then the maintenance. How did this happen? Part of the magic of user stories, when they are that backbone of a project, is that they are existing documentation at that point. And so whether you're a consultancy that is leaving and that admin has to maintain this, being able to see that user story and see how it changed over the course of that application lifecycle, or let's say an admin leaves and a new admin comes in, again, having that documentation and understanding why did we make the decisions that we made to solution it this way? What was the business value that we were trying to bring? How did this thing evolve over the course of the project is really, I think, essential documentation for any org. Can be that source of truth. So here we're gonna start on some of my tips. So, but really, how should they be written? I have seen far too many projects just start getting built without acceptance criteria, and acceptance criteria are essential. A user story is not complete without acceptance criteria. So again, you want to avoid ambiguity. I highly respect developers. They are very creative people, which means when you have ambiguity, like you say, easy, what's easy to me is not necessarily what's easy to a developer. And so having ambiguous words in there you don't know what you're going to end up with sometimes. And it may get overcomplicated, or it won't actually be what the client wants or what the business wants. So you want to avoid ambiguity. Every acceptance criteria should be able to be like either pass, fail, true, false. And if there's any ambiguity on whether it could be true or false, rewrite it. Again, with the, I like the small thing, but right around the time I start getting to about 7 acceptance criteria is when I start thinking, can I break this up into another user story? That's usually it for me, but it depends, of course. And then I also like to number my ACs. So I have seen ACs that are just kind of bulleted. I find numbering them to be easier just because it's easier to communicate with the rest of the team over the course of the project. It's easier to communicate with the business if they're numbered. If there's a problem with one AC, it's like, oh, AC 3 again. But it does help to number them. And it's such a small thing, but I've found very helpful in my projects. And then we have, some formality if we want to throw in for the ACs. If anybody wants to look up the Gherkin format, given, when, then. So if you are not used to writing user stories and acceptance criteria, using a more formal way to do it is certainly a nice way to start until you feel a little bit more comfortable. But ultimately, without the acceptance criteria, you do not understand what success looks like on that user story. That is the most vital thing that the acceptance criteria bring to it. Next, get user stories validated and approved. Don't start building them until the business has said, yes, you've understood exactly what I want, and I've also helped you understand what success looks like on this user story. Don't start building it. Don't do it. I would throw this under the category of CYA for those that don't know. That falls under the cover your ass activities. It's true though, but if you start building something and they go, wait, no, that's not what I meant, that's not what I talked about, by having that version control on your user stories, by having that, okay, here we do an approval process, we're doing grooming, we're putting in acceptance criteria, it helps you cover yourself and also make sure that you are connecting with your business, which is what you should be doing anyway for all these user stories. The stakeholders need to be involved. Another thing I've seen far too often is you have projects that are initiated by the IT department, and they're like, oh, well, we don't want to bother the business people. Bother the business people, because the IT department does not necessarily know all the end-to-end functionality of something. And so speaking to the business and getting those stories validated and approved by product owners, by the SMEs of the company, vital. Next, talk to your team and strategize. Just like talking to the business is very important, user stories have to be understood by the business. Business analysts, admins, whoever's wearing that BA hat ultimately has to be that bridge between the business and the technical team. So the other side of that coin is talk to your team. Make sure that your dev team is on board with your user stories. Do they understand what's going on? Because fundamentally, if your business doesn't understand the user story or the tech team doesn't understand the story, it is not a good user story. And so you need to go back and revise. And that's part of a regular feedback cycle that should be happening over the course of the project. Like, does this make sense to you? Am I writing these right? Because especially in consulting, like, you might end up with a different dev team every single time too. So what works for one team might not necessarily work for another team. And this is where I, maybe don't necessarily go off of all the formal stuff. Sometimes do what works for your team. And I would also say part of that is also strategizing. There are times where, especially when I have to write stories that I've never written before, like, I don't know, like I had to do integration user stories. I was like, how do you write a user story for an integration? I just spoke to the solution architect and I said, hey, what did those user stories look like on projects that you've been on previously? What did those successful user stories look like? And I learned. If I do new products, don't crucify me for this, but like, I asked ChatGPT, hey, can you write a user story for Snap Logic? And I was like, oh, that's how you do it. And ChatGPT like kind of threw me in the right direction. It does help, and also strategizing in a matter of, if you kind of understand what the overall requirement is, there is that art form part of writing that user story. And so it's, how do I want to lay out this information in a way that it can be understood again by the business, but also consumed properly by that dev team? And so talking it through with your dev team, and almost sometimes it turns into almost like a database. Like if you've got a database of user stories where, okay, this user story might apply to these things. You don't want to repeat necessarily the same AC or acceptance criteria for a whole bunch of user stories. So sometimes I can work it kind of like a database, but strategizing is helpful so that, I don't kind of just willy-nilly start on a path and, end up with, all those disasters that I mentioned earlier. So next up is business process maps. This one I kind of think of as, it really depends on how your brain works. I, for whatever reason, can listen to a requirement and just put them into user stories. That's just how my brain works. But for folks that are maybe not as comfortable writing user stories, I think this is where business process maps will help you find those gaps in your user story. Where if you can see all the different handoffs from the end-to-end business process, like, okay, it's this person, okay, that's my persona is doing this thing. These are the user stories that are going to come from that and with that persona. Okay, here's the next step in the process. These are the user stories that come from that. It'll make sure that your user stories cover what is happening in that end-to-end process. So not mandatory, but certainly if you kind of suck at user stories, great step. Also, they're great for giving your team context. Your developers, it's not great to necessarily, code and develop and low code in a vacuum. So being able to just kind of throw that context of that, here's what the end-to-end business process looks like, will ultimately get them thinking more about how this should ultimately look like at the end of the day. Then I also say have a great template. So I like, setting up my JIRA stories. I like putting in usually a section for user story. I usually have a section for acceptance criteria. I have a section for solution. I have a selection for test scripts. I have worked with far too many devs, sorry, and this isn't like I love devs, but I've worked with a lot of devs that will just write something and then never actually test it. So when I have a test script section, I don't let them move it through the pipeline without saying, here's the click path, AC1 is passed. Here's the next click path, acceptance criteria 2, pass. Here's the next click path. Here's who I logged in as. This is the record that I used, pass. And what I found was in that one stint of as a solution architect that I don't like to discuss, was I actually worked with another solution architect on that project, and they were like, wow, I've actually never been in, I've never gone into SIT where we've had so few bugs. And it really does make a difference, guys. We also have the description for context and summary. Like I have seen, if you go into JIRA, like people will name user stories all sorts of things. Try and think of some easy ways to kind of organize your stories so that they're easy to find, especially if you're going to have a bunch of small stories. That means that you might have more stories, in which case you need to make them easier to find in JIRA. So I like to use pipes. Those are the little things here. You can use dashes, whatever works for you. But I tend to organize my user stories and kind of write a little bit about the functionality that I'm trying to achieve on them. And then don't let formality get in the way of progress. Now, listen, it's okay to break the rules once in a while. And don't go back to your boss and say Vanessa Grant, said that I could do this, but like, listen, when I was a solution architect, and that one time that I keep saying I'm not going to talk about that I keep talking about, but it's, sometimes I did throw a solution on there. Or if we had a really tight deadline and the client really didn't care, did I harass them for giving me the business value? No, not every single time. Sometimes you have to kind of figure out what works for you, what works for your team. It's another thing, I was working with a BA once and we were doing CPQ, and it was going to have a massive number of ACs because we were trying to convert their this client's price book, and there was just no, it just had to all kind of be in one story. And they were writing 30 acceptance criteria in Gherkin format, and I was like, just throw it in a table. So I have a little one over here where I just made column 1 AC, here's AC1, AC2, AC3, so it's still testable. We still get the conditions that we need. It was still solved by true false, but it was easier for those developers to digest. It was easier for QA to understand what was going on for each AC, as opposed to having to read through 3 lines of text trying to kind of translate a pricing sheet. And then also your special flowers. I've worked with solution architects that have written books on clouds, and if they just kind of want to do things certain ways, do up a whole design doc that they're going to make all the devs follow and then write user stories afterwards, I'm not going to argue with the god of CPQ. I'm just not going to. It's what works for your team. Ultimately, you're not trying to impede progress by adding formality. And I think I'm a minute. I somehow managed to get that. All right, woo. Do we have any No, I guess we're pretty much done. And like, there's like beer and stuff. Just find me with a glass of wine out there. And thank you all for coming to my session. Go follow me on Twitter.
MarCloud is marketing automation for Salesforce. Our team of certified professionals can lead you on your Sales Cloud, Marketing Cloud account engagement, and Marketing Cloud engagement journey. Implementation. At MarCloud, we can assist with new implementations and complex migrations. Templates and training courses. MarCloud offers on-demand training courses to help you on your Salesforce journey. Free account audit. Understand your platforms with our free account audit. Support with ad hoc projects. Manage and implement your Salesforce and Marketing Cloud goals on a one-off project basis. Ongoing consulting. Lean on MarCloud as an extension of your team during your Salesforce journey. Simply visit our website to learn more.